Hello, Wooster Mennonite Church, and welcome to week 10 in God's story of grace. This week, we are thinking about the theme of coming out of despair and into celebration. And we'll be looking at Exodus chapters 12 through 15 and 1 Corinthians chapter 10. So as we delve into this story, this is really the departure of the children of Israel from Egypt. And we just have to pause for a moment and think about what that must have been like generation after generation living in slavery. And then all of a sudden, after this Passover event, the children of Israel are released from Egypt very quickly. And they're gathering their things and they're departing from the city. And as they're walking out, thousands upon thousands of onlookers are there, sending them off, the Egyptians wanting them to leave after the plagues and after the deaths of the firstborn children. And in the midst of all that, you have these thousands and thousands of Hebrews leaving a place they never thought that they'd leave. And as we think about this journey from despair into celebration, a big part of that journey often involves surprise. God surprising us with what is possible when we thought our circumstances couldn't change. And so as they go out in Egypt, we're told that they were led by day by a pillar of cloud and by night by a pillar of fire. And we might wonder, why is that? Why would God choose to demonstrate signs in that way to direct them? And one of the first things I think we have to realize is in their state of mind, they're leaving Egypt, but they're still very afraid. And God is demonstrating God's very presence with them through the cloud and through the fire. And it's really, in fact, God's ongoing presence that gives them the hope that they need to endure and to move forward. And as we go deeper into the story, we'll see how God's ongoing presence is so crucial. So as they're leaving and venturing out into the desert, Pharaoh begins to think about all that's happened and really to contemplate this huge change and the implications of that change for him and for Egyptian society. And he decides to pursue the Israelites. After all that he's endured, after all the plagues, after letting them go, now he is going to pursue them again. And so as he does, it just so happens that the Israelites are approaching the Red Sea, and they are terrified because they're blocked on one side by the sea, and then behind them they see Pharaoh coming with thousands and thousands of soldiers, and they fear for their lives, and they're crying out in terror. And God directs Moses to raise his arms and to hold his staff up, and as he does, God performs a miracle that all of the people could not have dreamed. They could never have foreseen that he would part the Red Sea for them to walk through. And as he does, they begin frantically crossing this chunk of land to get to the other side, bringing wagons over, bringing all of their supplies and their possessions. And just as they get to the other side, the Egyptians are reaching that bed of the sea and begin going through it after the Israelites. And after the last Israelite is safe on the other side and the Egyptians continue pursuing and haven't made it to them yet, at that very moment, God releases the waters again and they come crashing down on the Egyptians in this moment of utter chaos and judgment, both deliverance for the people of Israel, but also judgment for Pharaoh and his soldiers who were pursuing them. And in that moment, the people of Israel see God delivering them. And there's this famous song, sometimes it's called the Song of Moses and Miriam, but it's a song about God's deliverance. And that is maybe the moment in our story where we're talking about coming out of fear and terror and entering into celebration. This is a moment where Moses and Miriam and the Israelites turn to God and worship because of that deliverance that God provided for them out of this impossible and terrifying experience. And so there's this clarity in this moment of worship. And then as they proceed to continue on their journey, how quickly things can change and emotions can change as new challenges arise. And the Israelites, when they come to the place of Mara, they named it that because the water that they were drinking was bitter, and they needed water that they could drink that would be healthy and good. And God performs another miracle through Moses to make the water sweet and something that they could drink safely. And but this story is complicated because they had the experience of being delivered by God, and then they seem quickly to forget that God is with them and that God will provide for them. And then when they're presented with this other challenging situation, they grumble and complain and doubt again. And that's really where our story in Exodus ends, and we get a unique perspective on interpreting these events through the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, where he looks at all of these events from Exodus 12 through 15 through the lens of the Christian life. And he says the Israelites, they were baptized in a way into Moses when they came through the Red Sea. And when they experienced that presence of God in the cloud, it was like a type of baptism. And then he also says, when we think about it, God providing for them, he provides water for them to drink there at Mara. At other points, he provides manna for them to eat. And Paul says, God provided the spiritual food for them and spiritual drink. These were provided miraculously, and God's provision and work were given in a way that they couldn't have anticipated. And it became for them spiritual food and spiritual drink. And then Paul wants us to think about the Christian life and put it alongside that story of the Israelites coming out of Egypt. And he says in 1 Corinthians 10 that these struggles that they have serve as examples for us, on the one hand, of the frailty of our human mindset when we go through adversity, that we can be delivered, and then very quickly we can grumble and complain and forget. And Paul is trying to help us understand from a Christian point of view that just like the Israelites experienced God's deliverance and then struggled again, we too, in our own lives, can experience God's provision and deliverance and then turn around that maybe very same day or within a few days after and forget again and grumble again. And Paul encourages us to remember God's faithfulness. God was faithful to the Israelites. He gave them spiritual food. He gave them spiritual drink. He met their physical needs. He met their emotional needs and their spiritual needs. And Paul wants us to know that he will do that for us, that he is present with us. But then Paul also cautions us. What about our response to God? We're thinking about how God brings us out of a place of despair and fear into a place of joy and celebration. And part of that response to God is our response of gratitude. But part of that response is also our response of remembering what God has done and our response of worship. As we think about the song of Moses and Miriam, they were remembering what God had done and worshiping. And when we think about our own lives, how do we respond with our energy, with our use of our time, our talents, our resources, even with the use of our very bodies? How do we respond to God in worship and gratitude? And Paul says we need to be thinking about that, and we need to be serving God with that mindset, and to try also to avoid dishonoring God with our bodies and with our actions. And he tells further in 1 Corinthians 10 about how a number of Israelites struggled with that in the desert. So I'm hoping that as we've gone through these stories this week, that you are encouraged as you think about God's presence in your life, that God is with you, that God does not give up, but continues to work on our behalf and to walk with us through our struggles and our adversity. And even though we forget quickly and we can grumble and have the wrong mindset, that we're reminded again to check ourselves and to think about our thinking and examine it and try again to express gratitude for God's gifts and his presence in our life, and to trust in God's provision, and to make our life an expression of worship to God. So thank you for going on this journey with me on week 10, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until then, goodbye.